Commander Vextini stepped onto the neutral space station, with heavy footsteps that echoed through the metal corridors. She was massive, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with thick armor-like skin that had protected her through countless battles. Her razor-sharp claws clicked against the floor as she walked, and her yellow eyes scanned everything around her like a predator searching for threats. 12 major wars across the galaxy had left their marks on her body, scars that told stories of victory after victory. The Zealothi people were known throughout space as the ultimate warriors, creatures born to hunt and fight. For 300 years, no enemy had ever defeated them in battle. The space station, called Harmony's Edge, was built specifically for meetings between different alien species. It floated in neutral space, belonging to no one, where enemies could meet safely to talk instead of fight. The walls were plain metal, and the air smelled of recycled oxygen and cleaning chemicals. Vextini had been to many such places before, always leaving with better deals for her people, because everyone feared the Zealothi military might. Today felt no different. She was here to negotiate with humans, a young species that had only recently begun traveling between stars. From what Vextani knew, humans were weak creatures with soft skin and no natural weapons. They had only discovered faster-than-light travel 50 years ago, making them babies compared to ancient civilizations like the Zealothi. This meeting would be quick and simple. She would take what territory her people wanted, offer the humans some minor trade benefits, and return home with another easy diplomatic victory. The negotiation room was small and plain, with a round table in the center and chairs designed to accommodate different alien body types. Vextini chose the largest chair, her armored bulk making it creak as she settled in. Her keen senses immediately began analyzing the space, noting exit routes and potential weapons, habits drilled into her by centuries of warfare. Then the human representative entered, and Vexting had to suppress a laugh. Colonel Park Minho was tiny compared to her, barely reaching her chest if they stood together. He was compact and lean, with dark hair showing traces of gray and hands that looked weathered by work. His skin was that soft pink color typical of humans, completely unprotected by natural armor or thick hide. His teeth were small and flat, clearly designed for eating plants rather than tearing flesh. He had no claws, no spines, no visible weapons of any kind. To Vextani's predatory instincts, he looked like easy prey. Minho walked calmly to his chair and sat down, placing a simple leather folder on the table. He moved without hurry or fear, which surprised Vextani slightly. Most species showed at least some nervousness when meeting the Zealothi for the first time, but this human seemed completely relaxed, as if he were meeting with old friends rather than legendary alien warriors. "Welcome to Harmony's Edge, Commander Minho," said an accented but clear galactic standard. His voice was steady and polite. "I hope your journey here was comfortable." Vextine studied him for a moment before responding. Her translator device converted her deep, growling voice into words the human could understand. "Your territorial claims seem quite ambitious for such a young species," she said, getting straight to business. "Perhaps we should discuss more realistic expectations." Minho smiled, and his expression was neither afraid nor angry. Instead, he seemed almost amused by her words. "We've learned over the years that ambition often makes up for physical limitations, Commander. Sometimes the smallest creatures can achieve the biggest things." This response made Vextini's claws twitch with interest. Most species either cowered before Zealothi power or tried to bluster and threaten. This human was doing neither. He was simply stating facts, as if he truly believed his weak species could stand equal to her mighty people. The formal negotiations began in the usual way. They discussed trade routes between their territories, mining rights for valuable asteroids, and defensive agreements in case of attacks by space pirates. Minho proved to be well prepared, with detailed charts and data about everything they discussed. He spoke calmly about complex issues, never raising his voice or showing emotion, even when Vexti made demands that heavily favored the ZLATHI. As they talked, Vexti found herself studying the human more carefully. His small hands moved steadily as he took notes, and his eyes stayed focused on the documents and star charts spread across the table. There was something about his quietness that felt different from fear. It was more like the calm of someone who had seen many difficult things and learned to stay steady through all of them. The first day's negotiations proceeded exactly as Vexti expected. She made strong demands. The human listened politely and asked for time to consider, and they agreed to continue talks the next day. It was standard diplomatic procedure that would end, like always, with the stronger military power getting the better deal. Vexti felt confident that within a few days, she would return home with expanded territory and favorable trade agreements for the Zelathi Empire. But something about Colonel Park Minho's quiet confidence made her curious. There was more to this human than his weak appearance suggested, and Vexti found herself wondering what secrets lay behind his weathered face and steady eyes. After the day's negotiations ended, Vexti walked through the quiet corridors of Harmony's Edge. The space station felt different in the evening hours, with dimmed lights and fewer people moving about. Most diplomats had retired to their quarters or gone to the recreation areas, leaving the common spaces peaceful and empty. Vexti preferred this time of day when she could think without distractions. She found herself in the memorial section of the station, a long hallway lined with displays honoring the military achievements of different species. Each civilization had contributed something to represent their greatest warriors and battles. The displays were fascinating to study, showing the diversity of how different peoples honored their fighters. The crystalline Victor had contributed sharp, glowing shards that hummed with energy, each one representing a major victory in their 1,000-year expansion across their home galaxy. The Kalani had sent metals forged from plasma-heated metals, so advanced that they seemed to glow with inert fire. The Thrakari displayed weapons made from the bones of their greatest enemies, polished to a gleaming white. Then Vexti's eyes fell on humanity's contribution, and she almost laughed out loud. Sitting in a simple glass case were small pieces of colored cloth pinned to bronze medallions. The ribbons looked like they might tear if handled roughly, and the bronze was clearly a cheap metal compared to the advanced materials used by other species. Some of the ribbons were faded with age, and the bronze had turned green in places. They looked like children's toys next to the impressive displays from other civilizations. "Not very impressive, are they?" came a familiar voice behind her. Vexti turned to see Colonel Park Minho approaching, carrying 2 steaming cups in his hands. The smell that rose from them was pleasant, something warm and slightly bitter that reminded her of certain plants from her homeworld. "Quite modest compared to your people's achievements," Minho said, offering her one of the cups. "This is coffee, a drink we humans enjoy. I thought you might like to try something from our culture." Vexti accepted the cup out of politeness, though she had no real interest in human beverages. The liquid was dark and hot, and when she tasted it carefully, she found it surprisingly complex in flavor. "Your weapons technology appears equally modest," she replied, gesturing toward the simple display. Minho stood beside her, looking at the human memorial with an expression that seemed both proud and sad. His weathered face showed lines around his eyes, and Vexti realized he was older than she had first thought. Those lines came from years of experience, not just age. "We had a battle once, on our homeworld," Minho said quietly, his voice taking on a storytelling tone. "It happened during what we call World War II, in a city named The battle took place in winter, when the temperature dropped so low that metal would crack and water froze instantly." Vexti sipped her coffee and listened politely. Every species had war stories, usually about glorious victories or clever tactics that showed their superior military thinking. "The enemy had surrounded our forces completely," Minho continued. "They had better weapons, better equipment, more soldiers, and more supplies. They were better trained and better fed. Our people were trapped in a ruined city with nowhere to run and no way to get help. Any logical military commander would look at the situation and surrender to save lives. And you surrendered? Vextini asked, expecting the obvious answer. It was what any reasonable species would do when faced with impossible odds. Minho's expression grew darker, and his voice became quieter. We fought for 8 months. When our bullets ran out, we took kitchen knives from destroyed homes and used them as weapons. When we had no more knives, we fought with broken bottles and pieces of metal. When the buildings were bombed and collapsed around us, we went down into the sewers and kept fighting there. Vextani's claws clicked against her coffee cup without her realizing it. This was not the story she had expected to hear. When our soldiers were wounded so badly they could not walk, they would crawl forward to throw grenades at the enemy before they died. When we ran out of real explosives, we made bombs from whatever we could find. Mothers who had never held weapons learned to shoot. Children carried messages through burning streets while buildings fell around them. The Zealoty commander felt something cold settling in her stomach. That sounds like a foolish waste of military resources, she said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Minho nodded slowly. Perhaps it was foolish. We lost nearly everyone in that battle. The city was completely destroyed. Thousands of our people died, and thousands more were wounded so badly they never recovered. Then why tell this story as if it were something to be proud of? Because the enemy lost to Minho replied simply. They came expecting a quick victory over a weaker force. They were not prepared for that kind of persistence. They were not ready for people who would keep fighting, even when logic said they should stop. In the end, they gave up and retreated, even though they were stronger. Something in the human's tone made Vextini's predatory instincts stir uneasily. There was no boasting in his voice, no pride in victory. Instead, there was something that sounded almost like a warning. The second day of negotiations began like any other diplomatic meeting. Vextini arrived at the conference room expecting to continue their discussions about territory and trade agreements. But something had changed overnight. The story Minho had told her about Stalingrad kept playing in her mind, making her feel restless and curious in ways she did not understand. As they reviewed star charts showing the boundaries between human and Zealoty space, Vextani found herself distracted. She kept thinking about humans fighting with kitchen knives and broken bottles, about soldiers crawling forward to throw grenades even when they were dying. It made no sense according to everything she knew about warfare and military strategy. Colonel Minho, she said suddenly, interrupting his explanation about mining rights. Yesterday you told me about this battle in Stalingrad. Are there other similar examples in human military history? Minho paused, his pen hovering over the documents spread across the table. He seemed uncomfortable with the question, as if he would rather talk about anything else. But diplomatic courtesy required him to answer when asked directly. There are many such stories, he said carefully. Perhaps too many. Tell me another one, Vextani demanded, her yellow eyes fixed on his face. Minho set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a long moment, and Vextani could see him thinking, choosing his words carefully. There was a battle at a place called Thermopylae, many centuries ago on our homeworld, he finally began. A narrow mountain pass where a small force could hold back a much larger army. 300 of our soldiers took position there to face an enemy force of thousands upon thousands. Vextani nodded. This sounded more like normal military strategy. A tactical delay to give your main forces time to prepare defenses elsewhere. No, Minho said quietly. No reinforcements were coming. No rescue was planned. The 300 men knew from the beginning that they would all die in that pass. Vextani's spines bristled with confusion. Then why did they stay? What was the strategic purpose? Minho struggled to find the right words. They fought because someone had to. Because if they did not make a stand there, the enemy would march freely through our lands. They chose to die so that others might have a chance to live. This was completely different from anything in Zelethi military doctrine. Every species Vextini knew fought until defeat became probable, then surrendered to preserve their forces for future battles. Soldiers were valuable resources that should not be wasted needlessly. But these humans had deliberately chosen certain death with no hope of victory or rescue. That makes no logical sense, Vextini said, her claws drumming nervously on the table. Perhaps not, Minho agreed. But there are many more such stories. During our Second World War, there was something called the Warsaw Uprising. The people of that city knew the enemy was coming to destroy them completely. They had only hunting rifles and pistols against professional armies with tanks and artillery. Vextini leaned forward, unable to hide her growing fascination and horror. Surely they evacuated the civilians and surrendered the city. The civilians were the ones who fought, Minho replied. Old grandmothers learned to make explosive devices in their basements. Children as young as 10 years old carried messages through burning buildings while bombs fell around them. Teenagers with no military training attacked enemy tanks with bottles of gasoline. What were their military objectives? What did they hope to achieve? Minho's expression grew very serious, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. To die fighting rather than die quietly. They knew they could not win, but they refused to simply wait for death to come to them. Vextani felt something cold and uncomfortable settling in her chest. These were not military tactics, in any sense she understood. This was something else entirely, something that went against every principle of logical warfare and survival instinct. How long did they hold out? She asked. 2 months. 63 days of constant fighting in the ruins of their city. When it ended, almost everyone was dead, and the city was completely destroyed. The Zelethi commander stared at the human across the table, trying to process what she was hearing. In all her years of military service, she had never encountered anything like this. The Zelethi fought to expand their territory and increase their power. Other species fought to defend their homes or to take resources they needed. Everyone fought to win, and when winning became impossible, they surrendered to live and fight another day. But humans, it seemed, sometimes fought simply to fight. They chose death over surrender, not because it served any strategic purpose, but because something in their nature demanded it. They would rather die on their feet than live on their knees, as Minho had put it. These stories trouble you, Minho observed, watching her carefully. They make no sense, Vextini replied honestly. Your people seem to have a death wish that overrides basic survival instincts. Minho nodded slowly. Perhaps we do, but that same instinct has kept us alive when stronger enemies thought we would be easy to defeat. Vextini's predatory instincts were now screaming warnings she did not fully understand. Something about humanity was fundamentally different from every other species she had encountered, and that difference was beginning to seem very dangerous indeed. On the third morning, Vextini entered the negotiation room to find that Colonel Minho was not alone. A woman sat beside him, reviewing documents with the calm efficiency of a trained diplomat. She was shorter than Minho, with black hair pulled back neatly and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Commander? Vextini, Minho said, standing as she entered. I would like you to meet Colonel Kim Hyeri, our cultural attaché. She has joined us to help explain some of the finer details of human society and history. Vextine nodded politely, though she wondered why they needed a cultural expert for what should be straightforward territorial negotiations. Kim Hyeri stood and bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that seemed genuine rather than fearful. It is an honor to meet such a distinguished Zelethi commander, Kim said, in perfect galactic standard. I have read about your victories in the Outer Rim campaigns. Very impressive tactical work. Despite herself, Vextine felt pleased by the compliment. Few species bothered to study Zelethi military history with any real understanding. You are well informed for a cultural attach, she replied. Understanding military history is part of understanding culture, Kim explained as they all took their seats. War shapes how people think and act, sometimes for many generations. As the morning progressed, their discussions moved beyond simple, territorial boundaries into more complex topics about how their two species might interact in the future. Kim proved to be knowledgeable about both human and alien societies, offering insights that helped clarify misunderstandings between the two sides. But it was during the afternoon break that Kim shared something that changed everything. Vex thought she understood about humanity. Colonel Minho has been telling you about some of our historical battles, Kim said casually, as if discussing the weather. I thought you might be interested in learning about our kamikaze pilots from the Second Global War. Vextini's translator took a moment to process the unfamiliar word, kamikaze. Special attack pilots, Kim explained matter-of-factly. They would fly their aircraft directly into enemy ships, knowing they would die in the explosion. It was considered a great honor. Vextini's mind immediately began analyzing this tactically. Equipment malfunction forced them to crash into targets when their weapons failed. No, Commander, Kim said quietly. They chose to do it. They volunteered for these missions. The pilots would write farewell letters to their families, then climb into their aircraft, knowing they would never return home. The Zealoty commander felt her claws extending involuntarily, gouging deep marks in the metal table. That's impossible. No pilot would voluntarily destroy himself and his aircraft. That's not warfare, that's collective insanity. Kim's expression remained calm and professional. We had more volunteers than we had aircraft to give them. Young men would beg for the chance to die this way, seeing it as the ultimate service to their people. Vextini's mind reeled. She had thought the stories about Stalingrad and Thermopylae were extreme examples, unusual situations that pushed humans to desperate measures. But this was different. This was organized, systematic suicide as a military tactic. Perhaps it does seem like madness, Minho acknowledged, his voice carrying that same warning tone she had heard before. But we also developed something during our Cold War period, called mutually assured destruction. We built enough nuclear weapons to destroy our own planet several times over, for defense against overwhelming enemies. Vextini asked, though she already suspected she would not like the answer. No, Minho replied. We built them to guarantee that if anyone attacked us with similar weapons, we would destroy them completely, even if it meant destroying ourselves. In the process, the entire strategy was based on the promise that we would rather see our whole world burn than let an enemy conquer it. Vextini's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. You would exterminate your own species. If necessary, Kim said simply. Those two words hung in the air like a death sentence. Vextini stared at the two humans across the table, realizing with growing horror that everything she thought she knew about warfare and military strategy was wrong. Every calculation the Zealoty had ever made about conquering other species assumed that survival instinct would eventually override aggression. They assumed that when faced with total destruction, any rational species would surrender to preserve their lives and their civilization. But humans had built their entire military doctrine around the opposite principle. They had decided that some things were worse than death, worse even than the extinction of their entire species. They would rather die than submit, and they had spent centuries developing the weapons and tactics to ensure that anyone who tried to conquer them would die alongside them. We don't fight because we're strong, Commander, Kim added quietly, watching Vextini's reaction carefully. We fight because we've decided that some things are worse than dying. Freedom is worth more than life. Dignity is worth more than survival. Vextini's predatory instincts, honed by centuries of evolution and military training, were screaming warnings she had never felt before. Humans were not prey. They were not even normal predators. They were something far more dangerous, a species that had weaponized their own extinction and was willing to use it. For the first time in her long military career, Commander Vextani felt truly afraid. The final day of negotiations passed in a blur that left Vextani feeling dizzy and confused. Every document she signed felt wrong. Every concession she made went against centuries of Zelathi military doctrine. By the time the talks concluded, humanity had secured territorial rights that should have belonged to the stronger species, trade agreements that heavily favored their young civilization, and mutual defense pacts that treated them as equals to the mighty Zelathi Empire. Vextinia's claws trembled as she pressed her seal into the final treaty document. The warm wax bore the mark of her authority, binding her people to agreements that would have been unthinkable just a week ago. Colonel Minho and Colonel Kim watched her calmly, their faces showing neither triumph nor surprise, as if they had expected these results all along. "It has been an honor negotiating with you," Commander Minho said, as they shook hands in the human custom. His grip was firm, but not challenging, and his eyes held a strange mixture of respect and something that might have been pity. "May our peoples find peace in these agreements," Kim added. Bowing slightly in farewell, Vextani managed to respond with the proper diplomatic words. But her mind was elsewhere, still trying to process everything she had learned about humanity over the past 3 days. As she walked back to her shuttle, the corridors of Harmony's edge seemed different somehow, less neutral and more threatening. Every human she passed made her instincts whisper warnings about the danger they represented. The journey back to her flagship gave her time to think, but thinking only made things worse. By the time she reached her command ship, Vextani had realized that she would have to explain to her superiors why she had given away so much to such a seemingly weak species. The thought of that conversation filled her with dread. Her senior officers were waiting in the main briefing room when she arrived. Captain Morthic, her second-in-command, had served with her through 8 campaigns and had never questioned her judgment before. Commander Zeltic controlled their weapon systems and had destroyed entire enemy fleets with cold efficiency. These were warriors who understood strength and respected only victory. "Report," Commander Morthic said as she entered the room. "The crew is eager to hear about our new territorial acquisitions." Vextani activated the holographic display and brought up the treaty documents. The terms appeared in glowing text around the room, and she watched her officers' expressions change from anticipation to confusion to anger as they read. "Commander, these terms are completely unacceptable," Morthic growled, his own claws extending. In frustration, "We could crush their fleets within days. Their weapons are primitive, their ships are slow, and they have no real military experience against advanced civilizations. Why did you agree to treat them as equals? And then what?" Vextani asked quietly, her voice carrying a weariness that surprised even her. "Yes, Captain, we could destroy their military forces quickly and easily, but what happens after that victory?" The room fell silent. Her officers looked at each other with confusion, unsure how to answer what seemed like an obvious question. "We would occupy their territory and add their resources to our empire." "As we always do," Commander Zeltic said slowly, as if explaining something simple to a child. "No," Vextani replied, shaking her head. "That's what we do with normal species. Humans are different. They've shown me their history, and I've learned things that change everything we thought we knew about warfare." She manipulated the holographic display, bringing up an image of Earth as seen from space. The blue and green planet hung peacefully in the darkness, looking small and harmless and beautiful. "Humans don't surrender when they're losing," she continued. "They don't retreat when they're outnumbered. They don't negotiate when they're defeated. They make losing so expensive that victory becomes meaningless." "Commander, with respect, you're talking about a primitive species that just learned to travel between stars," Morthic protested. "How dangerous can they really be?" Vextani was quiet for a long moment, remembering the stories Minho and Kim had told her. Then she began to speak, her voice growing stronger as she shared what she had learned. They had a tradition during one of their global wars, she said. Enemies who had been trying to kill each other for months would stop fighting for a single day. They would climb out of their trenches and walk into the space between their armies. They would sing songs together, share food, and show each other photographs of their families back home. Her officers listened with growing confusion. Then the next morning they would return to their trenches and resume trying to kill each other. Not because they hated each other, not because their instincts drove them to violence, but because they had chosen to fight. They made a conscious decision to continue the war, even after remembering that their enemies were people just like themselves. The room was completely silent now. We are not dealing with prey, or even with traditional predators, Vextani said, her voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding. We are dealing with a species that has made peace with its own extinction. They will die to stop us, and they will make sure we die with them. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy, but they may be the most dangerous, because they treat their own survival as optional.